another podcast, and this is a very special edition because I actually have a guest. So I am honored to have Ruel from the University of Hawaii. He is a graduate student, a Ph.D. student nonetheless, in philosophy. So, you know, he already puts me to shame because that is my wish. I want to go back to school for philosophy. I'm just doing an independent study. So we decided last month that we would read up on, or I would actually catch up and read up on some existentialism because I was reading Camus already. I was reading The Stranger, and Ruel is probably an expert in existentialism, so we'll ask him lots of questions. So I don't know, we kind of read different things, but that's great. I think it's going to be a great discussion. So yeah, so welcome, Ruel. So glad. So what time is it in Hawaii right now?
Thank you. Yeah, it's noon. It's about around noon right now.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so it's about 4 o'clock in Colorado here where I am. So that's awesome. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to kind of start out with is asking you to tell me what it is like. Tell my audience what it is like to be a student, a graduate student in philosophy. Like, did you do your undergrad in philosophy and your master's in philosophy? What are the classes like? Are there any women in your classes? Because I know philosophy is like a male dominated kind of subject. I don't know, it's probably changing now, but you know, so what do you like about it? Is there anything challenging? Just, you know, anything you want to, because you know, my listeners, you know, some of them might be also majoring in philosophy or want to be a graduate student. So what do they have to look forward to?
All right, that's a bit of a challenging question.
Start anywhere, anything you want to tell us.
All right, so I had done my undergrad in philosophy, and I did one of my masters in. I have two. I did one in philosophy. But it's very, and from all three different schools, it's very different, the dynamics. I went to my undergrad at a small liberal arts school, so it was like very in person, kind of a nice survey, kind of differences in the department. And I did my graduate school in Leuven in Belgium. It's a very, very different dynamic with the professor at the top kind of giving the lecture, and then everyone kind of sits in the room and listens. So it's a lot more people. But I mean, Leuven's great for it because it's had like a philosophy institute since like the 19th century. So
yeah, no, that sounds super exciting. I mean, I always thought that would be fun to go overseas and go to school. I mean, that's the great thing about higher education is that it can take you all over the world or all over your country. So that's really exciting. Did you learn the language?
um uh explain hen flams.
Nice. Okay, that's great. Wow, I didn't think we got a little
Or Dutch. Yeah, Dutch.
Okay, no, that's really good. That's really good. So why did you decide to major in philosophy? Like what brought you to this path?
Oh, well, that's a good question. So I didn't really know much about philosophy when I was in high school. I think I'd read like The Prince, um, Machiavelli's The Prince. I think that's probably about it. My dad's a theater professor though, so he taught a little bit about like Aristotle's Poetics and like Sartre. So I had a sort of bit of a vague idea, especially like the guys that did plays like Sartre and Camus. So I had a vague idea of some of those guys. But then I was taking some classes in college, and my mom was trying to with me telling me what classes I should take. She's like, "Oh, you got to take philosophy." She's like, "You really like philosophy?" And I was like, "All right, I guess I'll do this. I don't really know what this is." And so I did it, and I had fun. I enjoyed the class. But yeah, basically, I don't know. I was in school and I wasn't doing, you know, especially my first year. I was kind of maybe partying a little bit more. Wasn't doing super hot. And second year came around, and the school's like, yeah, you're going to lose your scholarships if you don't start doing well in classes and so forth. And I was like, well, I got to really pick something I was interested in. And I was like, because I hadn't decided my major yet, and I'm in that philosophy class, and I had taken another one since then. And I was like, well, actually, I was doing good in those classes, and I'm liking that subject, so I'll just double down and take that. And so that's what I ended up doing. And I ended up getting straight A's after that, and became president of the philosophy club and everything. And I was like, all right, I want to go continue to study this.
That's That's awesome. I mean, it's so interesting to hear about everyone's path. I mean, because everyone goes to college for all different reasons. But I think if you're going for the humanities, you probably are going as well for the college experience, to meet people, to just be around, like-minded persons who are talking about interesting things. So that's really cool. I mean, I love all things humanities. So, well, that's great. So, do you have a particular philosopher or philosophy that you kind of follow or that you like? Like, who are your favorites that you just kind of read and?
Wow. Yeah, that's always, I think it's always a challenging question.
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in a lot of 20th century French philosophers. Sometimes they get a bad rep, but I really like Foucault and Levinas.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay, that's great. I have not read Levinas, but I did since I had kind of a background in women's studies. And so we looked at theory like Foucault's History of Sexuality. I think I used that for my dissertation. So I really like Foucault as well. And Judith Butler. And that's
yeah,
interesting, though. I find that that's really interesting to group the philosophers in their geography or language, like, the French philosophers, and then you have the German philosophers, and just to kind of see how they all.
it- yeah. You especially get that with with famous like German idealism. It's it's like both the idea and the geography and the language all together. I like other stuff too. I like a lot of philosophy science stuff. And also like Wittgenstein. I actually like Wittgenstein a lot. I did my bachelor's. I was kind of got really obsessed with like Nietzsche and Wittgenstein.
Oh my goodness. That's amazing because I find myself kind of gravitating more toward the continental philosophers. Analytic philosophy, I think I just don't understand completely. It's my brain doesn't necessarily work like that, and I would like it to. So now that's my challenge. But I quickly figured I have to find a way to access Wittgenstein and find sort of meaning in it. I feel like sometimes when I'm reading like the philosophical investigations or, you know, anything that he's written, that I'm being dropped in mid conversation, and that he's had lots of lectures and people have made all these criticisms and said, hey, Wittgenstein, what about this? What about this? And then his books are just answering that, because I can't figure out why he's so preoccupied with what he's preoccupied with, because he's like, when a person asks this, I'm like, who would ask that? I mean, I don't know. And that's the same thing. And I think it's all in the realm of logic that I kind of get twisted, because I'm trying to read like Aristotle's physics and some of his works on logic, and I don't know, maybe they're too practical for me. I need something more theoretical and abstract. I don't even know if that's just, or if it's just, I need a mathematical mind. I don't know what it is. So that really impresses me and intrigues me, that you don't shy away from logic and the analytical philosophers, that you write about them, and that's your thesis topic. I mean, can you explain that to me? Is it just, do I need to take some math classes? Is that what it is?
Well, I think part of it, and this is I think one of the reasons why I got into philosophy in the first place, especially like in high school, I had this sharp. This is an interesting way to go to this discussion, but I had this sharp distinction between like, humanities and sciences, especially in high school, because I feel like that is the norm that we're taught kind of in a certain way in America, and how to think about these subjects, how to organize them. If you're good at English, you're bad at math. If you're good at math, you're bad at English, etc. And that's because it was my tacit presupposition there. And my brother was always very into the sciences, very into mathematics. Um, and so we ended up differing, and we got very different scores and different tests and stuff. And so I just came into college like really hating that. But part of the reason I think I ended up changing my viewpoint was, one, my brother, and two, in certain ways Wittgenstein, because then you start to realize, I think, especially like Husserl is a big guy, especially for continental and phenomenology. Like he does, he was a mathematician, becomes a philosopher, and the same way Wittgenstein was an engineer, becomes a philosopher, and you end up seeing that like in a certain way, this distinction is a bit arbitrary. I mean, with you have logic in the humanities, or you have like geographies in the sciences. There's certain ways in which they kind of start blending together, especially if you look at the history of like the Royal Society in England, where you've got poets working with like Isaac Newton and so forth, and some of these ideas of the humanities and and mathematics and the sciences being as distinct as they are, I think ends up being in certain ways a product of American and Western civilization, and not so much maybe essential aspects of the disciplines themselves. And I think that was kind of, especially through Wittgenstein, that I kind of started to realize that, and made one of the reasons I think that it was attracted me to philosophy in particular was that philosophy let me like just question things from the get-go, and I didn't have to take this received knowledge, which so I took it. I remember taking a sociology class, and now I really like sociology. But at the time, I was really frustrated because I felt like she was just telling me how society works and how I was necessarily constrained in certain ways, and I was like, I couldn't do that at the time. I was like, no, I want to be able to think about and question these things. And now I really like sociology, but I like it insofar as I kind of feel like I can get it theoretically, and I don't have to take it all as like a set way that must exist for all time and so forth. And I think that was one of the strengths of philosophy. And so through that, I could start kind of getting into the theoretical aspects of like, say, math or logic, and look at these in ways that aren't as set in stone as people like to think they are. And that was like a lot of what Wittgenstein was doing, especially with like trying to, like Wittgenstein and Russell, especially Russell's project to try to ground mathematics in set theory, essentially into logic. And Wittgenstein being like, yeah, you can't do that. Like they're different kinds of logic. They're like completely separate in a certain way, and you have to kind of just follow their rules almost internally consistently, but one doesn't reduce to the other. And I think that kind of, there's ways of like trying to look at these things theoretically allowed a broader perspective. I was actually, oh, sorry.
Yeah, oh no, that makes a lot of sense, because I was just going to say, okay, so that kind of reminds me of, the mysticism in Wittgenstein and sort of spirituality, and I love whenever you were talking about, before we started, you were talking about comparative philosophies and comparative fields like the East and the West. And, whenever I see little glimmers of Eastern philosophy, and it reminds me of Buddhism, or it reminds me of Hinduism and that kind of spirituality, I get really excited, because then that, returns me to a door that I can go through, that I understand.
No, for sure. Yeah. I'm also very interested in the religious. I was a double major in undergrad. It was philosophy and religious studies. So I'm very also on board. I think that's a very fascinating field. And it's always kind of fascinating to connect the different people's kind of religious background. Like, for example, like Wittgenstein was obsessed with Kierkegaard. I would read him like all the time, recommend all his books, especially like, and also Tolstoy and Tolstoy's books on religion. So there's definitely, I think that dimension for sure, that kind of like, kind of mysticism.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, in a thinking mind, it makes sense that there is going to be this journey back and forth between religion and spirituality, and, reason and the intellect, and just trying to figuring out what's more certain, and kind of taking out that sort of external kind of authority figure. But I think, since the beginning of written time, humanity has been religious. I mean, we can't really deny that, even if we are, as a humanity, or as, our particular cultures or society is moving away from that. And I'm not sure if we really are, but that seems to be kind of the message that's being kind of broadcasted. I wonder if we're going away from our tradition, because there's something in that. You can take an atheistic or an agnostic lens to religion and find sort of the messages for life that philosophy also kind of deals with, whether it's, like theistic or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
It's all wisdom, right? So wherever you can get wisdom.
yeah, I think you're kind of, spot on there. And I think there's also an extent in which, especially retroactively, we like to have, I think this always happens, where you always like, you're later on in history, and you always can like look with a kind of maybe overblown arrogance at the past, and thinking you've really broke from them in certain ways. But I would honestly challenge that to some extent, because I also oftentimes think that even our concepts of atheism and secular society aren't as atheistic and or secular as we like to pretend they are. I mean, even Bertrand Russell was really struggling with that, the atheism, like in his book. He's got a whole book on logic and mysticism. So there's like even him, like this arch atheist, is really dealing with this question. Derrida and Jean-Luc Nancy have this kind of some of their kind of philosophy of religion, I think, especially like Jean-Luc Nancy when he goes into Christianity, is to some extent it's almost called because of a donut theology for like the secular society, and insofar as it's the same metaphysics as a Christian metaphysics. You just cut all God out of the center and keep the rest going. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. In particular, because you can see that in some of the kind of beliefs and behavior that still continue, especially for like some people that are like extremely very hardcore atheists. It's like it's still is this in many ways it's still like the cultural norms of either Protestantism or like maybe like a French atheist with like Sartre, like almost like Catholicism uh, of atheism. So it's yeah, I don't know if there's ever the clean break we'd like to think there is.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not necessarily that, faith, hope, and love are necessarily theological terms or ideas, but I think that there's such a centering on them, and just even the ideas in like Buddhism, like trying to find peace or trying to even find happiness.
Yeah.
It's all in the same kind of conversation. So
Yeah, well, and the other thing I like to think about too is just to what extent like humans, like we're like fairly similar across the board. So if we're going to put us in different circumstances, we will develop, I get relatively similar patterns to kind of try to deal with them in certain ways, I think.
yeah, I think so. The major questions of philosophy, have been with us since the beginning of philosophy and the beginning of humanity. So we're always trying to find the answer, and maybe we never will. And that's kind of where existentialism comes in, right? Because the existentialists seem to be able to accept and be aware of our limited knowledge as human beings, and the uncertainty that the silent world kind of presses upon us, even though we really desire to and try to seek certainty or seek answers and seek meanings. And that is what creates our sort of absurd relationship. And so I just finished The Ethics of Ambiguity. So I know you told me that it was super worth it to pick it up and to continue it, and it so was. I mean, I kind of want to go back and read the first part because I enjoyed the third part so well. She gets into racism and sexism and oppression and totalitarianism, and she really says that in order to not become a dictator or have this sort of totalitarian regime, there's always going to be violence in authority. So we always have to be reflective and keep asking ourselves, is this really heading toward liberation? And really place importance on the means, instead of just looking toward the end, because she says that, and I think maybe she is echoing other existentialists who are saying, other philosophers who are saying, as human beings, that's a part of who we are. We will always, since it's always our own individual freedom sort of against and alongside the collective, we'll always have this tension and this struggle. And so we can never be so narrow-minded and focused to try to get to that place where it's, peaceful and perfect.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, that's a good book. I think that kind of tech that you were bringing up, like where does it maybe start from, that tension between like almost a, I think Mary Warnock talks about this, like a private morality and a public morality. I mean, that's like, I think that's the foundational tension in Plato's Republic, that you kind of see between like how does the individual relate to the Republic as a whole, and then this trying to figure out how the kind of an ethical system relates between the two of them, and so like clearly like someone like Thrasymachus at the beginning very individual centric, and I think that tension carries forward. What I liked particularly about Beauvoir's response in a certain way, she even addresses, I think she addresses like Plato's Protagoras and the Republic in certain ways, where it's like Plato almost has this conception of, oh, you don't know what you're doing. You're doing something morally bad because you don't really know what the morally right thing to do is. Like there's this kind of idea of like you just need better knowledge, and then you can know what the kind of morally right action is. So it's all just like almost a hierarchy of revelation in a certain way. And this is kind of like a certain section of the Protagoras, I think, like is really this. And I think she responds to that line in particular. I can't remember where it is in the book. I think it's towards the end of the beginning, where she like basically like takes Plato to task there, and it's like where she's basically talking about like ethics kind of is fundamentally a choice, that like you have to have this choice, and it's not about who knows more or what better. It's like there's a moment where you just have to make the decision, and because it's a decision is what allows it to be ethical in the first place. And I think that was, to me at least, that was a very powerful part, I think, of her book.
Right. Yeah, I do see her kind of making a response to Plato. Now, I think I am about halfway through Plato's Republic, but he certainly has some very clear ideas on how human beings would be happiest and how we could all work together. You know, he has this idea of the principle of specialization, that if everyone just knows what they're meant to do, or they have a duty and they stick with it, you know, it doesn't matter where you are along the hierarchy of people and jobs and services, but that's, you know, that's really going to be important. But then, you know, the question is, you know, who's going to decide what my duty is and my principle of, you know, how I can be specialized, because I read the Republic and would like to be the philosopher king, you know, so I want to be so I don't know. So I don't know if Plato would be an existentialist, because I don't think that, I mean, he very much finds freedom in kind of a rigid structure. I mean, he talks a lot in the Republic about censorship, and, you know, to the point where he wants to take out these wonderful, amazing works of literature because they don't act courageously or fearlessly toward death. And they don't, I mean, so it's in a way, he really wants to fashion our minds and our desires. And I just don't think, I mean, you know, Simone de Beauvoir has such a nuanced, complex approach to everything. I mean, she'll even find, you know, the positives and the intentions of Stalin or various fascist regimes, because she's curious and she wants to be reasonable, you know. So yeah. So I see them being sort of opposite in a way, having.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that for sure. I think you got at a particularly interesting point earlier when you were just talking about Plato and specialization, right? Like everyone has this innate thing they're supposed to then do. And then your question was like, how do you find that? Like, and this is kind of like Rousseau's problem, right? How do you find what all these people want to do? Like, do we need some sort of general will or something, right? To find out what is this, like, I don't know, hidden truth of the people. And I think that particularly existentialists with Sartre and Beauvoir is this kind of like, no, there isn't an inner thing. There's no like specialization, like is innate in you. Like from the get-go, that is the problematic presupposition. Like you have to end up deciding the project. You have to end up deciding the specialization. It's not something that you could even discover. I think that it's just like something you have to kind of build. And I think that right there is like totally backs up what you were saying of them being basically opposites in a lot of ways. I do think there is a very clear distinction. I mean, of course, Plato can be read in a lot of very, very nuanced ways. I like, for example, you're bringing up his art criticism kind of stuff. One of the reasons I like to kind of read that maybe more as almost a kind of social criticism about the power of media to kind of create ideology in a certain way, maybe like some sort along some like Adorno lines or something. But I do think that's like definitely a component for Plato. But I don't like to broaden the term existentialism too much and bring everybody under it. Because I kind of like to look at it as kind of historical phenomenon in a certain way. But yeah, I wouldn't classify him there. But I do think that he is in dialogue, at least in his moral philosophy, she's in dialogue with him in a certain way. Like I think she's also trying to reject some of his concepts.
Right. Yeah, because the whole of the Republic is deciding how life is going to be from here on out, or how it could be, you know, and never. And so for de Beauvoir, it's always evolving and always changing and never kind of coming to a culminating point. So, yeah, so speaking about, you know, labeling different philosophers existentialists. So another recommendation I got, and so I should tell my listeners that, so Ruel has an amazing Instagram page called A Wandering Philosopher. Is that right? That's the name of it. And I get so many suggestions from that. And one one philosopher that I didn't even know of is Wahl. And so I picked up A Short History of Existentialism, which you can correct me, but I think this is out of print. I could only find a used copy. And so I ask, why did books go out of print? It's so frustrating, especially when I'm trying to look for different philosophers that I want to read. Sometimes, you know, it's some like knockoff printing, like individual, like Create Space or something that's but where is this, you know, the tradition is I don't know, it's breaking down if we can't have new copies of these books. But
Yeah. No, I there's something because I really want to talk about that for a second. But yeah, I think the Jean Wall one is interesting, particularly because you brought up. I think it's Levinas at the end who like quotes Husserl, and he's like every philosophy goes through three stages. One where everyone's like this nonsense. Two where it's like, oh yeah, everyone is this. And three, we kind of find its proper historical space. And I think that's probably what you're bringing up, where it's like talking about how broad existentialism could be, because I think Levinas is in particular talking just about that too. He's like, all right, is existentialism everything, or is it, you know, is it within a specific kind of movement?
right, and also that no one wants to be called an existentialist. I mean, yes. I think John Bull in the very beginning, he said, his first line is, I had a student come up to me and say something like, you are an existentialist, and he said no. So,
yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, well, because it's like I think the only one that kind of adopts the term for a period are like Beauvoir and Sartre. I think everyone else is just kind of like, I could be wrong, but I believe it's actually originally coined by Gabriel Marcel. I think he's the one that originally coins the term and applying it to Sartre. And I even think I could be wrong here. I think Sartre eventually like also rejects the term, but I think that's why he's got the paper like Existentialism is a Humanism, or Beauvoir has the what is existentialism. I think both of them kind of accept it in a certain way, but I think it's really just kind of them, and I think even there it's like a kind of tenuous acceptance.
They're so hesitant, and I always just wonder why I haven't been able to pin that down yet. Maybe they don't like how once it's out into the world, how people talk about it, because I read somewhere that and so you pronounce his name is Sartre. Like I always say Jean-Paul Sartre, but that's correct, is it?
Yeah.
I'm not good at French at all, so.
I do see that. My accent's probably also not perfect, but it's, you know, because I don't know. In French, when you have the consonant and you have the vowel, then you normally make the sound that's there. And so I was just, you know, I when I was in France, I was really trying to get through his name, but it's with that ha en français, it's I think it's
I like that, Sartre. Okay, so I'm gonna start saying it like that instead of just taking off the last two letters. Yeah, so I lost my train of thought, but I really liked this book. I thought it was so cool because it was published in 1949, and he's talking about different philosophers who are in the middle of their writing career. And so I've never read a book like that, you know, and especially like you said, Levinas chimes in at the end, like the last third of the book are philosophers commenting on what we've just read in the beginning of it.
No, I loved that. I thought that was brilliant, because you don't really always see that, where you have all these kind of contemporaries also then just start, because I think it's also got Berdiev, who's another big like kind of Russian Orthodox existentialist, and he also offers his points, and it's just like it's this cacophony of all these very different viewpoints, all kind of commenting on this guy, and Wahl really presents I think his ideas pretty well too, which is kind of, it's like very succinct and like very rigorous in a certain way. Like his explanations of like Heidegger and Jaspers are like, wow, this is quite clear for like a very short book.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I know that I have another book, but I haven't really started reading it. And you said that you didn't have this book, but it's Transcendence and the Concrete. So could you say something on what that means? Like, what is the role of transcendence in the concrete? I mean, one thing that I think I've got a little bit on the concrete, at least, is that, for instance, when you're reading, and I haven't finished this, but when you're reading Nausea, or when you're reading The Stranger by Camus, there's this there's this emphasis of bodily sensations. If you are very much embedded in the body, that those bodily sensations are nauseous. Like they're dissatisfying, or they're not even dissatisfying, but they're actually almost uncomfortable, or there's like a visceral kind of disgust or something that is happening. Because like in The Stranger, for instance, the main character, he's kind of wandering around, he's going on a beach vacation with his friends, but it's like he's very keyed into, almost someone who is hypersensitive to heat and the sun and light, and just the way that his, that it's almost like an absurd kind of instance of the human body in a world that causes us discomfort and pain and anxiety on like a physical level. So I don't know. So maybe that is what, Jean Wahl is going to talk about with the concrete, but I don't know. Maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure, or I wouldn't.
And so how did you find
I would
this the only book that you've read of him? Like, how did you find it? Because I think that I'm going to love him so much.
Yeah, I like him a lot. I'd read some essays I think I'd found online. I'd originally learned about him from I think Bruce Bow has a history of like the movement of Hegel in France, like how Hegel was interpreted in France. And I've been, in particular, he focuses on Wahl in particular because it's this idea, especially like in history of French philosophy, that Hegel comes to France with Kojève's lectures. And then Judith Butler talks about that. A lot of people, Bataille, Foucault all mentioned Kojève's lectures. But like Hegel had been in France in the 19th century, but it was mostly like kind of Hegel's logic, Hegel's encyclopedia stuff. It was just kind of more diffuse Hegel. And you get the Hegel that you can kind of use for existentialism. You kind of get the first book on that, which I was talking about, was Wahl's book. Wahl has a book on Hegel and like the déchirement, like the tearing of consciousness in a certain way. And I think that's kind of the physical, kind of conscious focused Hegel that I think that kind of sets the tone for what would end up being existentialism and so forth. So I think that's how I learned about Wahl. And then I'm with you. I think there's a lot in his stuff. But what you mentioned, you mentioned something about like books going out of print and like how sad that is. I think that is a consistent theme that happens, and it's pretty interesting for philosophical history in general, because you get this where there is a collection of names that end up being the ones that are important, and their books remain in print. And once those names have kind of been solidified, everyone else kind of falls through the floorboards. And it doesn't matter how key they were or central they were, they kind of start to disappear. And I think that you can, in a certain way, you can see like in just formations of history. For example, like Kant, you can find a Kant book quite easily, probably even at a Barnes & Noble. You can find a book by Kant. But you're not going to find a book by Herder or Hamann or the other 18th century, or Lessing, the other 18th century German philosophers. Kant's the name that ends up remaining. Same with France, like Rousseau and Voltaire, you can find their books, but you don't, D'Alembert and some of the Helvetius, like some of the other French 18th century philosophers, you can't find their books. Like I know some of them, the last English translation goes out of print in like the 19th century. And so like they start to disappear, and then when people look back retroactively, they just kind of focus on the big names again, and you have this kind of falling out of the minutiae. So I think that's an interesting phenomenon, because I think it forces people, especially if you're trying to be faithful to your philosophical history, to actually pay attention that you might be missing a lot of important sources here.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when so I just started reading philosophy of March of this year. And so when I'm reading, like say de Beauvoir or Jean Wahl or anyone, they're mentioning all of these different, writers. And so then I go to look on Amazon.com for these writers so I can, be more into get the conversation holistically, and they're not there. So I don't know. Do you think that this is, that we are not our species is not a literary species anymore, and we're falling away, because I don't think that in a world where we were a literary species, that books, especially important books, and I find the same thing in women's studies as well. I've actually emailed, feminist theorists who are alive today, and especially like in the LGBT community, like the theorists in that field, and their books that came out like maybe in the 70s, it was so important, and I used to have a copy, and then I went to Europe, and so I gave it away, and I want another one. But I can only find it like on eBay for $500. Yeah, it seems like a real problem that books go out of print.
Yeah. I don't think it necessarily reflects on the maybe us as a literary species. I do think it reflects on like a kind of modern hubris, though, where we think we have access to all the information that's ever existed, and that we can just. I mean, you can find a lot of PDFs of books, but you'd be surprised at how much stuff you still can't find, either PDFs or like on archive.org, or just like in translations in general. We have a false sense, because you were talking about analytic philosophy, and I think sometimes this sadly happens with that too. There's just clearly a false sense in which the translation is ignored as a fact of history. But I mean, that's sadly the case. Like most of the time, the only way you can get these books is through a translation, and then to have the translation, someone has to spend all the time to basically rewrite a philosophy book over again. And that, I think in particular, is a way of carving out a lot of more minor names or even important names that get left to the wayside because there's no good translations for them. And then we tacitly assume the translations are just like a neutral fact, and that the English translation is just as good as, let's say, like the original.
Right.
You
Yeah, I
have
guess
to have,
that's why it's so important to learn languages. And that's why I guess usually when you're going to graduate school, you choose your languages. So, what were the languages that you have taken for reading knowledge in graduate school?
oh yeah, of course. Okay, now you're putting me on the spot. I I've been I, I studied French, still trying to study French, and I've been studying Japanese, but yeah, don't ask me to speak Japanese.
Okay. No, I mean usually it's just for for reading knowledge, right? So you can read these books in the original, and that's area that I fell very short on in graduate school, because I did take my languages, but I don't think I really kept up with them, or I used used my knowledge to actually read these texts in their original language, and so I'm not even sure I can call myself a real academic, because I'm reading everything in English translation and just forever wanting to. Like, I definitely have the desire to go back and seriously apply myself to language learning, but I don't know what it is, my lack of discipline or lack of work ethic or something, because I feel like been trying to learn Spanish, for instance, forever, and I just can't do it. I just haven't done it.
Learning, I mean, just learning another language is super hard, especially as an American. And I don't think it necessarily also reflects on, yeah, I mean, like if you were trying to do like area studies or something, obviously you'd have to learn the language. But I think, especially in like modern American academia, I think there's plenty of people that like write all sorts of books that don't know another language. Um, I mean, I think it's like Chomsky is famous linguistics, right? And he's clearly like super influential. I think he only knows some Hebrew and English, and he like creates linguistics that are supposed to apply to all languages
Oh,
universally.
wow. I did not know that about Chomsky. That is surprising.
So it's like I wouldn't stress too much. But I do think the only time I actually ever felt like I was actually getting anywhere really with my languages, to some extent, was when I was living and speaking with people and like listening to music and trying to read all the time. I think that's because I think you kind of have to be engrossed in a milieu. I think otherwise it's very difficult.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. Oh, traveling. I so miss it now that.
Yeah. Well, and especially I think there's a unique point in history too with America. Like you never had, especially you look at history. I mean, you're getting a little bit now maybe with like China and Mandarin, um, but like you've never really had a point in history where there's been like one language that covers like basically an entire continent. And like that's very weird. And even in the American history in the 19th century, Louisiana and Maine are speaking French. A lot of the South is speaking like, you've got Spanish, you've got German in the Midwest and Pennsylvania and stuff. Like and there was like tons of indigenous languages. So it's like in a certain aspect of modernization that has kind of created a very odd English bubble, I think, in the
I
U.S.
see. That's so interesting. I never really thought about it like that. I kind of just always felt, oh, why maybe, they were focused on in the past, they were focused on learning these languages. But from that perspective, it's like, you were forced to, in a sense, if you wanted to read anything, because translations in whatever your language is
Yeah.
weren't so available.
Well,
And
like oh, sorry.
and also sad because I feel as if, I would have loved to kind of grow up learning Latin and Greek and just having that be an automatic sort of education for me, and then, taking language more seriously rather than just, a German class in junior high where we watched, a lot of movies. So, I miss that. I miss that kind of education.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I remember I met I remember meeting a Hungarian guy that spoke like 8 languages. I think that's also dependent on like where your country's is socioeconomically. I remember meeting an Ethiopian guy that spoke like fluent English, also spoke French, Dutch, and had to learn Chinese just to due to the economic situation. And I think his original Amharic, like just due to kind of like I think socioeconomic reasons too. So I think that's also part of it. But yeah, no, I swear I had the same German class in high school where you just watch movies. Um, yeah, I think some of it's kind of maybe like a unique historical position, and there isn't also the focus on like teaching people language, at least in America from a young age, which makes it more challenging because I think when you but,
Yeah, that's true. All right, well, we are slowly coming to, I think we only have about 15
oh,
more minutes. So
no,
one thing I really did want to ask you about is because you said that you were reading Caligula. So there's this
oh
book
yeah,
that
yeah.
I also
And
picked up.
I also saw you read Le Juste, right? The Just Assassins.
I did, yes, yeah. I read all of them. I thought that this particular edition was really helpful because the
Yeah.
four plays kind of span his works almost. You get the earliest to the almost the latest, and so it was interesting to kind of try to figure out maybe and track the evolution of his ethics. I think because it seems like Camus in particular is really struggling, and maybe Sartre does as well in Nausea. I don't know because I haven't finished it. I'm not very far in it, but he's really struggling with, what is a moral sense of justice, because he has all these characters that, he has both sides, right? Both representations, like the characters that are, wanting to do whatever it takes to get the kind of country and nation that they envision, and then you have others that aren't so sure, and they have all these moral quandaries and hesitations, and then they go seek like religion and spirituality and try to find their own individual morality because changing a nation is too difficult. And so it seems like he's really struggling with ethics in this.
Interesting. I like that reading. Yeah, no, I think that's definitely especially well because Camus has these kind of phases he kind of writes, right? He writes like a book, a play, and almost like a philosophy work, right? Like the Stranger, Myth of Sisyphus, Caligula,
Mm-hmm.
with like I think it's the Just Assassins, the Plague, the Rebel. Like these kind of like they kind of go in cycles, which I think is just as a retrospective artistic phenomenon, just brilliant. Like a philosopher doing a play, a book, and a philosophy work. I love that. I mean, Sartre is like much less organized. Like it's just like all right, book here, play like 10 plays here. It's just all over the place.
Yeah, Camus does seem more consistent, and he does really,
Yeah.
you can really see him kind of growing up into, what he ends up thinking. And so sad that, his life was cut short, because I think we'd get, twice as many works from him if he would have, not died so tragically.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I think part of it, especially like with the Just Assassins, I think, right? Yeah, is that concern about like when you have the revolution, do you fall too hard behind the ideals of it to such an extent that you become the thing you would be really rebelling against in a certain way? because he talks about this in The Rebel with like Nechayev and some of the Russian anarchists and so forth in their early revolutions. Maybe just taking the revolution too far in such a way that like negates the revolution. I think that's the concern: how to have like a moral revolution in a certain way and to be at the cusp in which you can both revolt and not like negate your kind of own revolt. And I think some of it's also him particularly struggling with trying to defend a certain revolt in Algeria without justifying a lot of the kind of like the basically the attacks and so forth that was like part of the Algerian Revolution, while also trying to also incorporate the fact that he was part of the Resistance in the World War II. So I think he's kind of trying to walk that middle line, because I like Sartre is like much more like on board with the Algerian Revolution. So I think he doesn't have to deal with that conflict as much. He's just like, no, Algerians need to be independent, anti-colonialist. But Camus trying to, I think, walk a line where he can still think people deserve independence without justifying, I guess, violence to like take that independence. I don't know if he fully succeeds, but I think that's where he's trying to work through at least.
Yeah,
At least
it's certainly interesting to read, because I think, and this is part of his literary genius, that it doesn't seem didactic. It's not, he doesn't tell you how to think. It's almost kind of difficult and a mystery figuring out, you know, what character we should even sympathize with. I'm not sure. So that's interesting, you know. I mean, I would like to pursue more of the, you know, his Algerian history and ancestry and the, you know, the context, the historical context.
He's a Beauvoir. He was born in Algeria, but I think to a Spanish mom, so he's also got that, because I think he also in certain parts deals with the Spanish Revolution. So yeah, I think I could be wrong.
No. I think you're exactly right. And so let me ask you this then, because, and I could be wrong with what I'm reading of the setting, but it seems like a lot of his plays are centered in Eastern Europe. Is that not correct? Like, for instance, Cross Purposes, it's the mother and the daughter. I don't know if you read that one. They're in kind of like this, I don't know, it just seems like a Baltic state or something, and they want to go to the sea. And then even in The Just, weren't they terrorists and like, yeah, they were Russian. So I was just wondering, you know, why is he writing about like those countries?
I can't speak to the other one because I'm not 100% sure, but I know the Russian one. I think in particular is he sees that, especially not the because Russia has a few revolutions, but I think it's the 1905 revolution, and I think he'd read a lot of the Russian anarchists, and so I think he's particularly fascinated with that movement and how they responded, and then clearly how Russia would eventually end up, which he's clearly very anti-Soviet Union. So like I think there's some of the concerns there. Is it both a justified revolution and maybe how it ends up not the way I want it to be, like not a moral kind of state that ends up occurring. And I think he's walking a line here. He thinks in a way of baseball saying the Russian Revolution could be justified without, you know, justifying the end of it. And the same thing you have with the French Revolution, right? Like maybe the terror is a problem, but like the French Revolution itself could still be justified. And I think that's why he's pinpointing those areas.
Right, I see, just parallels. And then he has The Possessed, his last play, which is based on a Dostoevsky book. And I think the existentialists were really well read with, I always have a hard time saying his name, Dostoevsky, is that right? And maybe the Russian novelists, which I have not read. I've read Nabokov's Lolita, but that's not really the same thing. So,
well, I like Nabokov a lot. I haven't read Lolita, but I've read a lot of his other ones. I think
he's also a literary genius. I mean, he's wonderful. I mean, even Lolita, it's the most disturbing kind of book morally, but it's so brilliant, and that's just why it's disturbing, because you just, I don't know, you get really taken in by the narrator.
I think with the Russian guys with Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky, though, I think the part of it is, I think they were kind of, because especially like I'm more familiar with Tolstoy. It's like he is hitting at some of the questions that the existentialists are dealing with. There's a relationship to Schopenhauer and Hegel. There's like a concern about like the everyday life. And Tolstoy ends up being kind of like very, very Christian in certain ways, almost like Kierkegaard. But I think as you kind of get that through literature, you can kind of see like a philosophical precursor. There's a book I read, which I don't know. There was stuff I didn't like from it, but it's William Barrett's Irrational Man. He was like kind of American existentialist at the
Okay.
time. And there was a lot of stuff I didn't like from the book. Like I think he goes off and it doesn't always make sense. But there were one point I do think he was good at was kind of trying to look at the historical lineage that led to existentialism, and he in particular focuses on the Russian novelists
Oh,
as a
okay.
big precursor.
That's interesting. And what was the name of that book?
Irrational Man by William Barrett. And
Okay.
he's more like almost in certain ways like an American kind of Heideggerian, I feel like.
Okay.
But
That's yeah.
let's trace a kind of history of existentialism, specifically geared towards like an American audience at his time, which was probably like the 60s or 70s, I think.
Okay, that's really interesting. So I guess the last question, since we're, we have to end pretty soon here, that I would like to ask you is, speaking of books and your wonderful recommendations, so how do you find time to explore whatever you want to explore in philosophy when you, I'm sure, have so much assigned reading in your classes? Or, so how do you choose, like, what goes on your Instagram page? Is it books that you are reading for class, or I'm guessing that they are not books that you're reading for classes, but they're just your own exploration? So how do you choose what books you're going to read, and how do you balance out that, the assigned readings with the readings of choice?
Fair, yeah. That's a good question. um, I would say half and half. Um, a lot are from my classes I'm taking, and then generally when I take a class, I try to read stuff related to the class and get interested in other kind of related stuff. And so like so it kind of moves around the class, and I end up using those sources for like my paper and so forth. So like kind of give me a jump up. So there's a good chunk of those books kind of are those like are tangentially related to class or like kind of come out of that. At the same time, I sometimes like to take a day, especially with a smaller book that I think I could read either in a day or in 2 days, and like kind of as a break, we'll sometimes go to a coffee shop and try to read through that. And that is sometimes where you get the very unrelated stuff to my classes. That's the kind of think it's just kind of through those things that you would get them. And then some of the novels and stuff, it just if I'm not binging Netflix, the novels are for free time. And so that's where some of the novels and poetry comes out of.
Great. Oh, that's great. And what do you binge on Netflix?
What I binge on Netflix, just very random things. So, some good, some bad. I've been okay. Yeah, I was rewatching Rick and Morty on Hulu. I've been watching some of What We Do in the Shadows. I think that's on Hulu, which has been pretty fun. Yeah, like I said Netflix. Netflix is almost the metonym for like
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, for sure.
Russian Doll, I feel like is a kind of. I don't know if you saw that one. I feel like that one's got some very existentialist vibes. Um,
Oh, okay. I'm not sure if I did. It kind of sounds familiar. Does it have that girl with like the curly red hair?
yeah,
Natasha Lyonne or something?
that might have been her name.
I don't, okay, I don't know. If it was a show that I could have watched like years ago, maybe then I have watched it. She kind of has a deja vu kind of
Yes,
experience.
yes. I think it came out 2 years ago, maybe.
Oh, okay. Okay, yes. Time I don't understand it anymore since 2020. So I
That's
don't
fair. I mean, that's always kind of fascinating, though, right? Because it kind of gets at this kind of I don't know, Bergson Heideggerian kind of perspective of time of being not as like we like to think it's like super objective and outside of us, but at the same time, it's like it's clearly very experiential, like at its kind of core.
Yeah, I feel like the pandemic's been going on for 3 years and it hasn't.
Exactly.
So I don't know if time has expanded for me or something. Well, all right. Well, thank you so much, Ruel, for taking time out of your busy day and for sacrificing the beautiful Hawaiian sun to be inside and talk to me. I feel like I've learned so much. It was a great conversation, and I really appreciate you being my first guest on this.
Oh, I don't
Is
know.
is there anything that you want to say as we end the podcast, or any other social media that you want to promote? Everyone should go follow Ruel on Instagram, a wandering philosopher.
Well, I
Um,
like your account's great too. You always have great books that you're definitely one of my favorites.
Thanks. Well, I really appreciate that. That's really kind. All right. Well, Hegelians, we are going to end this hour. Thank you so much for listening. And if you also want to be on my podcast, I'm always looking for guests. So just let me know. All right. I will catch you all later. Okay, great. That was like an hour. Thank you. I was so worried. I was like,